Hey guys, tonight we will quietly walk through the velvet-draped corridors of a forgotten palace, where incense once mingled with the musty scent of decay. And behind a locked door, a prince of the most powerful bloodline in Europe slowly rotted, not because of war or rebellion, but because of himself. You're about to hear the story of Don Carlos of Spain, not a fairy tale. There's no glittering crown, no heroic death, just the life of a man imprisoned in silence, in darkness, in oblivion. His father ruled half the world, but for Carlos, even sunlight was a luxury. This isn't a sweet bedtime story. Not at all. Tonight's tale includes royal madness, secret confinements, and a level of inbreeding that would probably make your high school biology teacher quit. Seriously. If you think your family's complicated, just wait and be grateful you've survived another family dinner. And before you lie back and get cozy, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. But only if you genuinely enjoy what we're doing here. Oh. And while you're switching on your nightlight or pulling the blanket up to your chin, drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see how many of us are awake together across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. That boy was born to the sound of resounding bells, in the heart of a vast empire where every heartbeat was recorded in ink and ceremony. Don Carlos, a name that rang like prophecy, heir to the Spanish throne. Grandson of Emperor Charles V, son of the infamously stern and devout King Philip II. Like other royal children, he was born into silk and splendor, but without the laughter of a mother. For just 4 days after giving birth to Carlos, Maria of Portugal, his mother, at 5, he suffered from unusually prolonged fevers. He whispered to people who weren't there. One tutor once reported that Carlos giggled through an entire math lesson, not because the lesson was funny, but because someone had just told him that addition was meaningless. And that person wasn't in the room, in the rigidly Catholic Spanish court, where everything from a nod to a sneeze was done with solemnity. This discordant rhythm in the prince could never be made public. At official events, Carlos still appeared in royal armor, golden-plated helmet on his head, hand raised in a soft wave, though he never learned to ride a horse. There's one bizarre anecdote few know. At a lavish banquet, when a young noble laughed too loudly from wine, Carlos stabbed a fork into his hand, not out of anger, but because the laughter hurt the prince's ears. Who would have thought that hypersensitivity to sound came with such unroyal reflexes? As a teenager, Carlos's strange behaviors only intensified. He was once caught hiding a cat in a cabinet, then forgot it. He shouted at a statue of a saint because its eyes were watching me sleep. And once, he refused to wear shoes because leather is a cursed material. Yes, imagine a Spanish prince walking barefoot around the palace. It wasn't fashion, it was psychology wearing a crown. You might think someone should have helped him, but sadly, in the 16th century, there were no therapists, no antipsychotic medications, and certainly no one sending him to meditate in Bali. The court had only one solution: conceal, avoid, and hope he'd get better on his own. Modern researchers, after reviewing rare surviving medical notes, believe Carlos suffered from at least 3 major issues: a severe mental disorder, post-traumatic brain injury, and profound malnutrition due to paranoia about being poisoned. On top of that, he had a habit of fasting whenever he wasn't allowed to hunt. Once, he refused food for 3 days just because he couldn't go out to shoot birds. And honestly, by now you might be starting to feel a little uneasy. But don't worry, the part that truly chills the spine is just ahead, because when oddity turned into a threat to the throne, the Spanish court chose a solution quieter than death itself. And so, on a winter night in 1568, while Madrid still slept beneath a soft mist, and the final candle in the palace flickered out, a group of royal guards, led by King Philip II himself, silently entered the prince's chamber. No clashing swords, no accusations, just a whisper. For your own safety. Don Carlos, gaunt and wide-eyed, had just woken up. Who? He asked. No one answered. The door was locked from the outside. The windows were sealed, the velvet curtains drawn. And from that moment on, the Prince of Spain was no longer an heir, but a ghost, trapped within his own palace. Here's something few people know. It was Philip II, the same father who once cradled Carlos as a baby, who ordered his imprisonment, not out of hatred, but out of fear. The king couldn't risk placing a mentally unstable heir on the throne. In a time when Europe was already unraveling from religious reformations, war, and crises of faith, for Philip, silence was strategy. Historians still argue about this. Some say it was a necessary, decisive act to protect the dynasty. Others, especially those writing from countries opposed to Spain, call it a crime, imprisoning your own son until he withers away. It doesn't sound like a family matter, does it? It sounds like a Shakespearean tragedy. And in fact, many believe Shakespeare drew inspiration from Carlos for the character of Hamlet. Think about it. A mad prince, lonely, speaking to ghosts, trapped in a cold castle. It fits, doesn't it? The room where Carlos was held became its own world, where time froze, light vanished, and breath became the only whisper left, day after day. He had only himself. No books, no friends, no morning sparrows or evening church bells. Occasionally, a servant would quietly bring in a bowl of thin porridge. But most of the time, there was only the soft scratching of Carlos's fingers on the wall, or the mumblings that guards could hear through the door crack. Once, it's said that Carlos began to fear his own shoes. "Leather is cursed," he said, and began tearing the cloth from his feet with his own teeth. Yes, you heard right. Perhaps if he had been born in the 21st century, Carlos would have had a therapist, a YouTube meditation channel, and a therapy dog named Paco. But sadly, the 16th century was not made for compassion. It was made for order. By now, if you feel everything is sinking lower, you're right. So did he, slowly, bit by bit. Carlos began to fade. Sores appeared on his legs. No one tended to them. His breath grew labored. No one listened. He asked to see his mother, who had died over 20 years ago. The reply was silence. There's a secret note from a priest who entered his room to pray with Carlos during his final month. He wrote, he clutched the crucifix, but did not call for angels. He called Mother 3 times, then fell silent like ash. It sounds soft, but it aches, like wind over crumbling cliffs. And finally, on a day in July 1568, the prince no longer breathed. There were no bells, no funeral procession, just a plain wooden coffin quietly placed in the royal crypt. No stone, no portrait, not a single farewell. You see, Carlos didn't die from war, nor from betrayal. He died from being forgotten while still alive. And the strangest thing, though erased by the royal family, he lived on in operas, in plays, in whispers across Europe. Because sometimes, those who never become kings leave a mark deeper than any reign. After the quiet death of Don Carlos, the Spanish court seemed to exhale. No more sudden outbursts, no more screaming during mass, no more forks in guests' hands. The palace returned to its bells, its red carpets, its marble-cold rituals. But one thing they did not expect, the outside world did not go silent. In European courts, especially in England and the Netherlands, where tensions with Spain ran high, Carlos's death was not seen as death by illness. They called it a subtle political assassination, disguised as silence. Anonymous pamphlets, satirical poems, rumors whispered in Amsterdam, taverns began to spread. Philip poisoned his son to keep the throne from trembling hands. Sounds dramatic, it does. But in an era where letters were censored and truth lived only through leaks, whispers felt more real than official records. The greatest political consequence did not lie within Madrid's palace, but in the hearts of the people and the colonies. At that time, the Netherlands, still part of the Spanish Empire, had grown weary of Philip II's rigid rule and religious repression. When news of Don Carlos's mysterious death reached the Dutch nobility, they did not see a mad prince. They saw a symbol of oppression, of a court that would eliminate its own blood to keep its grip on power. And so the fire of rebellion burned brighter. People painted Don Carlos as a Catholic martyr, eyes full of sorrow, a cracked crown on his head, standing in the shadow of royal power. In England, where Queen Elizabeth I was watching every move of her Spanish rival, the court seized the opportunity. Playwrights released tragedies featuring a mad prince killed by his father. No names mentioned, but everyone knew who it was. To such an extent that many modern historians believe the imprisonment and obscure death of Don Carlos was one of the sparks that ignited the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Netherlands. A quiet death became the reason for tens of thousands to take up arms. Historians still debate this. Was Philip II protecting the throne, or was he simply helpless in the face of his son's mental collapse? Some argue he chose the most gentle solution possible. No trial, no execution like in other rebellions. But others counter. When a monarch uses death to suppress unrest within the palace, that is not mercy. That is policy. Cold enough to chill the bones. Right or wrong, the death of Carlos became a political blind spot. Everyone saw it, everyone talked about it, but no one could touch the truth. That was when the story slipped from the hands of historians and into the hands of writers, musicians, and artists. And you know it well. Once history becomes art, the truth may bend, but emotion lives on. But then, the question no one dared to speak aloud within the cold walls of the palace became the most persistent one over centuries. What did Don Carlos die of? The court's announcement was brief. The prince passed away after a long illness. A short, emotionless statement. With no detail, no solemn rite. For someone who was once heir to one of the largest empires in the world, the silence was suspicious. Official sources at the time were nearly mute. No doctors came forward, no medical logs published, no words of farewell. But within the harem were whispers outlived rituals. They said Carlos was slowly poisoned. Others believed he starved himself to death, and many blamed the quiet madness that had devoured his soul long before his body gave up. What makes it darker is this. Perhaps all the theories are partly true. Modern historians, with access to leaked medical notes and secret letters from palace servants, have reconstructed the horrific health picture of Don Carlos in his final months. He was severely malnourished, his weight estimated at under 40 kilograms. His body was ulcerated, infected, his skin darkened and peeling. One guard wrote, "The smell from that room rose like from a crypt left unsealed." He refused food, believing it poisoned. He scratched his own skin with his nails, thinking someone was living inside him. And, in his delirium, Carlos spoke to his dead mother, whose face he never remembered, but whose name he whispered every night like a child lost in a desert of loneliness. It was rumored that in his last days, Carlos no longer knew who he was. He murmured in Latin and Spanish, mixing scripture with names no one in the palace had ever heard, a doctor wrote. The prince no longer looked straight ahead. His eyes drifted elsewhere, as if listening to a voice beyond the wall. One rare truth that posterity knows is that Carlos was not anointed until the final moment. King Philip II, cold and meticulous, ordered the last rite delayed, fearing news would spread and cause political unrest. Only when the doctor confirmed he will not survive until morning was a priest allowed to enter, and in the flickering candlelight, Carlos gave a faint smile when asked, "Do you forgive those who hurt you?" The reply was a nod, or maybe a spasm. No one knew for sure. Some contemporary scholars, especially in genetic medicine, believe Carlos may have suffered from a syndrome combining psychosis, epilepsy, and a rare metabolic disorder. In conditions of isolation, without treatment, without psychological care or nutrition, his body simply destroyed itself in tragic sequence. But regardless of the exact cause, poison, starvation, illness, or prolonged mental breakdown, the death of Don Carlos was never simply natural. And here lies the terrifying part. Perhaps no one killed Carlos with a blade, but everyone let him die. The palace turned its back. The king, who once called him the light of the lineage, chose never to enter his prison room, not once, and an entire system of power, built to glorify royal life, watched Carlos wither away, like an oil lamp forgotten in a corner of the room. And then, that death, silent as a last breath in a windless room, was announced in a single message sent from the royal court. The Prince Don Carlos has passed away after a period of illness. May his soul rest in the Lord. That was all. No grand ceremony, no national proclamation, not a single bell rang to mourn the royal heir. In a country where even the Queen's sneezes could become part of a chronicle, the death of the heir to the throne was written in a line as cold as an accountant's memo. Just imagine it. A prince, grandson of Emperor Charles V, the only son of King Philip II, dies. And there is no public funeral, no priest giving a eulogy in the square, no black-draped carriage, no royal orchestra playing the farewell march. Even his portrait in the Grand Hall was taken down in silence. They handled Don Carlos's funeral like disposing of a broken item. A local priest was summoned to the palace at night. His body was quickly washed, wrapped in coarse linen, and placed in a plain wooden coffin. No name, no insignia, no royal seal. Some old servants whispered that the fabric used for the coffin was the kind reserved for royal servants. Though that has never been verified, but you know how it goes. When silence is too perfect, rumor replaces history. At the burial, there was no grand procession, only a small group, a few guards, a priest, a wooden cart quietly entering the royal monastery of San Lorenzo de El Escorial at dawn. The crowds knew nothing. The nobility were not invited, and the nation was busy with other ceremonies, as if Don Carlos had never existed. At El Escorial, his tomb was placed in the Infante's crypt, reserved for princes and princesses who never ruled. No bust, no memorial stone, not a single name etched in the marble. He was buried just steps away from the kings, but centuries away in historical memory. Later, historians called it the funeral of erasure. It was not meant to bid farewell to a man, but to bury a problem. Philip II did not only want to bury Carlos, he wanted to bury the memory of royal imperfection. Creepy, isn't it? But that is where history brushes against the shadowy corners of the psyche. Nothing is more terrifying than being erased in silence. Not condemned, not accused. Simply vanished from all official records. As if never born. And that is the most haunting part. Because even if you die in delirium, even if your body rots in a dark room, if your memory is also buried, that is the second death, the real one. After Don Carlos's body was laid to rest, the story seemed over, but in truth, his death was only the beginning of something far more chilling. A calculated effort to erase a person's existence from their own history. Imagine it. This wasn't forgetting to write a name in a family tree. This was a full-scale campaign of silent deletion, carried out by experts in controlling narrative. The Spanish royal family at the palace. Don Carlos's portraits were removed from corridors. Incomplete paintings were destroyed. Artists were ordered to indefinitely pause all works containing his image or symbols. Court records, diaries, even council notes bearing his signature were recalled, edited, or vanished completely. Personal letters between Carlos and court members were sealed in secret archives, where only those authorized to forget could access them. In official historical manuscripts published under Philip II's reign, Don Carlos was mentioned in a single line. The prince died young due to health reasons. No medical record, no expression of sorrow, nothing. Worse still, in later records of the dynasty, many chroniclers skipped over Carlos entirely, as if after his birth, things became too inconvenient, so best not to mention him. You see, this wasn't forgetting, it was intentional erasure. The kind of forgetting we might today call digital wiping, except instead of software, they used power, decrees, and silence. Historians still debate Philip II's true motive. Some say he was too ashamed of his own failure, a king ruling half the world, unable to save his only son from the loneliness he had created. Others believe it was a ruthless but necessary political move. A powerful Catholic empire could not let future generations know that the heir to the throne once sat on the floor, ragged, whispering to a statue, because if people knew the truth, they would ask, if even royal blood cannot resist madness, how can we believe in the divine right of kings? And Philip could not allow that question to exist. The irony is, that very silence created a massive void in the imagination of posterity. Where history stopped speaking, art began to speak. plays, novels, operas, all rushed in to fill the silence with speculation, legend, and sorrow. Perhaps that is what Philip never anticipated. You can bury a body, but you cannot bury the haunting memory of it. The name Don Carlos may have been erased from royal records, but it began to live again on stage, in paintings, and in the minds of those who believed that behind every royal sin was a child unloved. And while Don Carlos's image was erased from every corner of official memory, another question quietly emerged. What about the others? Those of royal blood. Those who may have called him brother, or at least kin. Yes, Don Carlos was not the only child of King Philip II, but he was the only child from the first marriage, with his first wife, Maria of Portugal, who died just 4 days after his birth. This made Carlos a unique figure, both in title and in isolation. After Maria's death, Philip II married 3 more times, mostly to secure European political alliances. Among them, the most notable was Elizabeth of Valois, a beautiful and intelligent French princess, who became Queen of Spain and stepmother to Carlos. The twist, and it is quite tangled, is that Elizabeth was originally betrothed to Don Carlos himself, but for political reasons, she was reassigned to marry his father, Philip II. As you can see, the House of Habsburg never lacked awkward loops, and this is where the siblings of Don Carlos come in. From his marriage to Elizabeth, Philip II had 2 daughters, Isabella Clara Eugenia, Catherine Michelle. They were Carlos's half-sisters, but due to the age gap and difference in mothers, they were never truly close. Isabella, who later became governor of the Spanish Netherlands, was wise and composed, very different from her emotionally volatile half-brother. Historical records show almost no interaction between Carlos and his younger sisters, partly because he was isolated early, both physically and mentally. Partly because his sisters were raised in strict and distant fashion, groomed for political marriages, not familial closeness as we understand it today. What is worth pondering is that after Carlos's death, not a single sibling spoke up. No letters of mourning, no record of incense lit, or a name remembered. Modern historians fiercely debate this. Some believe the sisters were too young when he died and were shielded from the truth. Others argue that the silence was not apathy, but training. In a court where every gesture had political weight, sometimes the only way to love was silence for survival. And, tragically, that silence made Carlos easier to forget. No written memory from blood relatives, no family tales passed down. Carlos vanished like a speck of dust swept from the red carpet of power. And so, people remember Carlos not because someone in the family loved him, but because an entire dynasty pretended he never existed. Strange, isn't it? A prince born to rule, remembered only for being forgotten. But in that silence, the name Don Carlos began to rise. Not in palaces, not in royal archives, but in the ink-stained pages of European literature, theater, and music. Because where historians are forced into silence, artists will speak instead. In the late 18th century, nearly 200 years after Don Carlos's death, a German playwright named Friedrich Schiller decided to breathe life into the ghost once locked behind velvet curtains. In his famous play, Don Carlos, Schiller did not recount the story as history recorded it. Instead, he transformed Carlos into a romantic hero, idealistic, freedom-loving, passionate for social reform, and in love with his stepmother. Yes, you heard right. From a sick and lonely prince, Don Carlos became a revolutionary flame extinguished by a tyrannical regime. Historically inaccurate, certainly, but emotionally true. And European audiences at the time could not look away. Historians still debate this play. Some criticize Schiller for romanticizing a tragedy too complex. Others defend him, arguing that Schiller never intended to recreate history. He only sought to resurrect the pain of being rejected, and Don Carlos was the perfect embodiment of that. Several decades later, the inspiration from Schiller lit another stage. The great composer Giuseppe Verdi transformed the story into a famous opera, Don Carlo. And this time, Carlos stepped onto the stage with a mournful tenor voice, surrounded by dense choruses of haunting, despair, and overlapping political schemes. In that opera, Carlos was not just a prince, he was a symbol of a heart crushed by duty, a love silenced by the throne, and a yearning to live truthfully in a fabricated world. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because it is not just one person's story. It is the voice of children burdened by expectations, forced into molds, then abandoned when they no longer fit. Not only on stage, Don Carlos also appeared in novels, paintings, even in metaphors of popular culture. Some scholars have suggested that Shakespeare may have drawn inspiration from Carlos for the character of Hamlet, a lost prince, speaking with ghosts, trapped between title and conscience. You see, Carlos did not need a throne to live on. What preserved him through the centuries was not power, but the raw pain of someone unheard. In a world still filled with children taught not to speak up, still filled with adults trapped in invisible frameworks, the story of Don Carlos becomes a silent mirror, reminding us that what humans often need is not to rule, but to be loved, understood, and remembered as themselves. And if you are still listening now, in the quiet of night, then perhaps somewhere beneath the stone vaults of El Escorial Monastery, a once-buried name is gently rising again, not as a scream, but as the soft whisper of understanding. And when the final breath of Don Carlos faded into the cold stone walls, the clearest question then, and also the most dangerous, echoed in the minds of every royal advisor. If the prince is dead, then who will inherit the throne of Spain? The answer did not come immediately. For Don Carlos was not only the sole son of Philip II at the time, but also the only legitimate heir recognized by both the church and the colonies. Yet, as you have seen, Carlos's death did not paralyze the court. On the contrary, it was like a chess move the king had long prepared, and true to a man obsessed with controlling every word, every punctuation mark, Philip II left no room for uncertainty. After the death of Don Carlos in 1568, the throne was not immediately passed to anyone, because Philip II remained alive and continued ruling for another 30 years. But the death of his son forced him to begin again, to search for another successor, someone less unstable, and of course, easier to control. Then, in 1571, Philip married his fourth wife, Anna of Austria, who was both his niece and a princess of the Austrian Habsburg line. Yes, you guessed it, another loop of royal inbreeding. From this marriage, the second son was born, but he would become the true successor. Philip III. Philip III was born in 1578, 10 years after the death of Don Carlos. And here is what stands out. He was raised entirely differently, no longer a political symbol from the cradle like Carlos, no longer burdened with an empire before he could walk. Philip III grew up protected, but also in the shadow of a forbidden story. His half-brother had once been a prince, had once been chosen, and had once been locked away to die. Some records claim that the name Don Carlos was never to be mentioned in front of the young prince, as if Carlos were a black ink blot scraped from the page of history, to make room for a new, clean, and more acceptable heir. And then, when Philip II died in 1598, Philip III took the throne. No one asked about Carlos, no one mentioned 1568. All ceremonies unfolded smoothly, neatly, like a dress rehearsal long prepared. But the truth is, if Carlos had not died, that throne would have been his. The price for having a safer king was the complete erasure of the one who was meant to wear the crown. Sad, isn't it? But sometimes, succession does not come from merit, but from survival. And once we speak of Don Carlos, we cannot avoid the cold shadow that stood behind him from beginning to end. His father, King Philip II of Spain. That king was not an easy man to understand, much less to like. You see, he was not a tyrant waving swords and screaming executions. He did not yell, he did not drink, he did not punish impulsively. On the contrary, Philip II governed the empire with black ink, with handwritten letters, with private meetings and a silence sharp as steel. Among the many nicknames he earned, one stood out, the Paper King, El Rey Papelero. Because he could spend hours every day writing decrees, signing decisions, reading reports from colonies stretching from Europe to the Americas. A father to an empire, but a man who never once embraced his only son when the boy needed him most. Philip II was a man who believed in order, morality, and absolute unity. To him, everything had its place, even emotions, even family, even a son losing his way. From the time Don Carlos was young, Philip kept a clear distance, not because he hated his son, but because he feared weakness. Carlos was born with signs of instability, a crooked head, uneven eyes, prone to fever, crying fits. To Philip, these were omens of imperfection, and imperfection, in his eyes, was danger. In a rare letter to a close advisor, Philip once wrote, "I love my son, as a believer loves the church, but if his existence harms the soul of the kingdom, I must choose what is right." Sound familiar? That is no longer a father's voice, but the voice of a king choosing power over blood. Historians still debate the inner world of Philip II. Some believe he truly suffered having to imprison his son, that he cried upon hearing of Carlos's death, but chose not to appear, for fear of showing weakness before the court. Others argue Philip never allowed emotion to override politics, that he did not visit his son's room because he did not want to disrupt the narrative he had carefully crafted, that the prince was not ill, just resting. There is one lesser-known account. For the entire 6 months Carlos was imprisoned, Philip never once stepped into the room. Instead, he received updates via letters. Physicians were ordered to report on health daily, but were not to raise hope. One preserved report reads, "The prince continues to refuse food, mind in disarray, sore spreading," and Philip's response, "Continue monitoring, limit contact, no change to detention order." Only when Carlos was truly dying did Philip allow a priest to perform last rites, but he did not go himself. No final whisper from a father, no last glance, no voice saying, "I am here." Perhaps he thought it was right. Perhaps he feared that if he saw Carlos, he would weaken, and a king must not weaken. For Philip II, ruling was a sacred duty. Royalty was not built on affection, but on sacrifice, even ruthless silence. And the greatest tragedy is that he applied this principle to his own son. After Carlos's death, Philip never mentioned his son's name in any official letter. Among the over 3,000 surviving letters he wrote, the name Don Carlos is almost entirely absent. Only one quiet line appears in a private journal. "God has decided," as if he were commenting on the weather, not on a life that once called him father. From then on, Philip ruled for another 30 years. He married again, had more children, led Spain to the peak of conservative Catholicism, strengthened the Inquisition, expanded the colonies. On paper, he was one of the most powerful kings Europe ever had. But in the hearts of the people, in literature, in whispered legacy, he remains the father who locked his son away to die. Perhaps the cruelest irony is this: Philip II spent his life building an empire to immortalize his name. But it is Don Carlos, the forgotten, imprisoned, erased son, who is remembered more. Because while power dies with policy, tragedy lives on in the hearts of people. And when there was no more Don Carlos, no more son to terrify the court with ragged breathing or midnight screams, King Philip II returned to what he did best, ruling through silence, through paperwork, through absolute belief in order. If you imagine kings as majestic figures on horseback, swords gleaming in sunlight, Philip II was not that type. He hardly left his desk. Some days, he sat for over 12 hours, reading letters from the provinces, writing administrative orders, approving budgets, judging petitions, all on paper. In handwriting so small, so neat, so coldly controlled, it felt almost inhuman. The Spanish Empire under Philip II was a vast machine. It stretched from the colonies in the Americas to Flanders, Naples, Milan, Sicily, the Philippines, named after him, and even parts of Africa, as people used to say. The sun never set on Philip's empire. But to maintain such an empire, you could not be weak. And Philip II never wavered. After the death of Don Carlos, he showed no signs of collapse. Instead, he intensified central control, strengthened the power of the church, and used the Inquisition as a psychological weapon against both commoners and nobles. To Philip, every ideological deviation was a potential rebellion, freedom of speech, not in his dictionary, compromise. Even less. One very Philip II thing is this. He did not need glorious victory to feel justified. Even in failure, he still wrote letters as if nothing had happened. Like after the disastrous defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, when the fleet was destroyed by storms en route to invade England, he calmly said, "I have done what I must. If God wills otherwise, that is God's will." Cold, yes, but it showed one thing. Philip II did not rule with his heart. He ruled with an unshakable belief that he was fulfilling a divine mission. Under his reign, religion and governance were not just allies. They were two arms of the same body. He built monumental structures like El Escorial, not just a palace, but a monastery, a library, a fortress, a symbol of the eternal power of Catholic Spain. Inside, everything was calculated. The number of steps, the windows, the placement of statues, all carried theological and symbolic meaning, a place to rule, to pray, and to bury those he did not want the world to remember, including Don Carlos. Modern historians still debate whether Philip II's harsh control was strength or fear. Some believe he was the last steadfast monarch, holding Spain together through the Protestant Reformation storms. Others see him as a symbol of paranoid rigidity, who used faith as a tool to crush freedom and eliminate all difference. Yet, it is undeniable. Under Philip II, Spain reached its peak in military, economic, and religious power. His empire was wealthy, from New World, silver, and gold. Powerful with armies stationed everywhere, and terrifying because anyone could be put on trial for a statement that sounded heretical. But that very rigid model of rule carried the seeds of decline. Because when you silence every dissenting voice, you do not create peace. You create silence before a storm. And after Philip II's death, the tensions he suppressed began to erupt. The Netherlands revolted. Colonies grew unstable. The royal family began to fragment. His successor, Philip III, was considered weak, lacking resolve, and unable to preserve what his father had built. Perhaps because he was raised in the shadow of a father too great, too controlling, too severe, leaving no space for anyone else to grow. And so, the legacy of Philip II became like a palace so perfect, no one could live inside it. Yet, while King Philip II sat at his desk in El Escorial, meticulously writing edicts on faith and tax policy, outside those cold stone walls, millions of people were still living, or trying to live, in an empire where the brighter the royal light shone, the deeper the shadow fell on its people. Life for ordinary Spaniards under Philip II was not the magnificent scene painted on church ceilings, but a repetition of days where suffocating religious rituals, inflation-driven price hikes, and crushing taxes fell upon those with no right to ask questions. You can imagine, if you were a farmer in Toledo or Seville in the mid-16th century, every morning you woke not just to plow the fields, but to worry if someone in your village would be summoned to court, accused of heresy. The Inquisition under Philip did not only punish converted Jews or Muslims left behind after the Reconquista, it also stalked Catholics who were not the right kind, say the wrong thing about the Mass, fail to kneel at the right moment, answer the catechism improperly, and you could be interrogated. Worse still, your own neighbor could report you. Promise tax exemption in return for loyal cooperation with the faith. And so, fear soaked into every thread of daily life. People whispered instead of speaking. They made the sign of the cross before every meal, not from piety, but because they did not want to be watched. Meanwhile, the Spanish economy entered a cruel paradox. The empire was rich, but the people were starving. Silver and gold poured into ports like Seville from the New World, but most of it went to fund religious wars across Europe, from the Netherlands to England. and the people. They bought bread with coins debased in value. Inflation soared. A loaf of bread could cost more than a day's wages. Historians call it a period of wealth corroded from within. And does that sound familiar? Just like Prince Don Carlos. The reign of Philip II was rotting beneath its ornate exterior. In the cities, nobles and clergy lived entirely apart from commoners. They had their own homes, their own horses, their own laws. Meanwhile, the lower classes had no access to education, healthcare, or land ownership. Women had virtually no voice except within convents. Children born in poverty often did not live past the age of 10, killed by disease, malnutrition, or the indifference of the state. There is a record from a priest in Valencia. He wrote, "People came to church with cracked feet and patchwork clothes. They prayed fervently, not because they loved God, but because there was no one else left to ask." The most terrifying thing was not poverty, but being poor and not allowed to complain, being hungry, but not allowed to ask why the gold was not for you, being tired, but forced to bow, because that was called faith, to the king. Order was the highest priority, and that order must be preserved through absolute obedience. So, if the people complained of poverty, they were taught it was a trial from God. If they were sick, it was because their souls were not yet pure. If they rebelled, an entire village could be burned as a warning. You see, while the palace of El Escorial was built with marble, the homes of the people were made of wood and clay. A heavy rain could wash away a village, but no storm ever shook the throne. And in that contrast, you begin to understand why the story of Don Carlos haunted people so deeply, because it showed that even inside the palace, suffocation and decay existed. Not only commoners were crushed, even a prince, born to rule, could be imprisoned and forgotten. That is why, when people whispered the tale of the prince locked away to die, they were not only speaking of Carlos, they were speaking of themselves. And to understand how a prince like Don Carlos could be imprisoned, erased, and forgotten without anyone daring to speak, you must look at the political system under Philip II. This was not just a monarchy. 16th century Spain, under Philip II, was a machine of power shaped in the image of divine authority, where the king was not only a ruler, but God's representative on earth. He did not simply sit on a throne. He sat at the center of a dense network of paperwork, ritual, and near total obedience. The heart of this system was the royal court, first in Madrid, later in El Escorial, where every decision, large or small, passed through the king's hands. But do not imagine the court as a democratic council in discussion. Not at all. It was a heavy, slow atmosphere, where every word was weighed like gold, and every glance could become evidence for accusation. Philip II had no prime minister. He delegated no real power to anyone. Instead, he ruled through a system of specialized councils, consejos, each responsible for a different region or domain of the empire. The Council of State, Consejo de Estado; the Council of War, Consejo de Guerra; the Council of the Indies, Consejo de Indias, for the American colonies, and a host of smaller councils. Sounds like decentralization, perhaps, but all councils reported directly to the king. No decree had legal power without Philip II's personal signature, written in his own tiny, uniform handwriting. Many scholars call this a despotism by correspondence. Power did not rest in the sword, but in ink, seals, and information control. More importantly, this system was not only strong administratively, it was deeply intertwined with religion. Indeed, politics and the church were two sides of the same coin. For Philip II, to rule was not just to maintain social order, but to guard the true faith. This explains why he so fervently supported crusades against Protestantism, expanded the powers of the Inquisition, and used bishops as political informants. And this same system allowed Philip to imprison his own son. Without trial, no parliament questioned it, no lawyers defended it, no press protested. There was only a handwritten command: lock the doors, seal the chamber, forbid all contact. In a system where the king answered to no one, the will of the king was the law. So even a prince of royal blood could not resist the hand that wrote the order. There is a little-known fact. From 1,560 to 1,580, Spain experienced virtually no civil reform. Because everything had been so tightly controlled by Philip, provinces like Aragon, Castile, Catalonia had parliaments in theory, but in practice, they were suppressed by royal-appointed governors. Any sign of opposition was labeled heresy, treason, or disruption of sacred order. The brilliance of this system was that it made people believe everything was running smoothly, every problem wrapped in ritual, every decree justified by high ideals, and every disappearance, like that of Don Carlos, covered with the phrase, "For the supreme good of the kingdom," but deep down, the system was like a castle built on sand. Each layer of power added another burden on the people. Each level of control slowed every decision. And every accumulated silence became a time bomb waiting to explode after Philip's reign. So, after his death, things began to crack. His son, Philip III, inherited the throne without the ability to control the system his father left behind. The councils lost their central leadership. Bureaucratic inertia caused Spain to fail on many fronts. Financially, militarily. In short, the political system under Philip II was like an antique clock, exquisitely crafted, beautiful, and precise, but only as long as one man alone wound it every morning. That man was Philip, no one else. And if you have followed this far, perhaps you are now wondering, how did law function in such a vast empire? How could a prince, second in line to the Spanish throne, be imprisoned, isolated for months, then die, without a single trial? No charges, no sentence. The answer, as with all things under Philip II, lies in a legal system both sophisticated and deeply frightening. On paper, Spain under Philip II had a more developed legal structure than many other European nations of the time. There were civil laws, criminal codes, royal courts, and regional legal traditions. Each area, Castile, Aragon, Valencia, had its own legal codes, reflecting its history and culture. Sounds fair, maybe, but the truth was far more complex. Under Philip II, law was not a shield to protect the weak. It was a machine to protect the king's order. In other words, the law served the throne, not the other way around. The clearest example was the fact that Don Carlos was never tried. In any true rule of law society, depriving a person of freedom, whether commoner or prince, requires at least a basic legal process. Charges, trial, sentence, but here, Carlos was seized at night, imprisoned indefinitely, cut off from all contact, and died in darkness. No charge, no judge, no defense. Why was this allowed? Because at that time, the law granted the king a divine right, derecho divino, a political and religious belief that the monarch was chosen by God to rule, and therefore not bound by earthly laws. By that belief, Philip II was the living law of Spain. Just imagine, if the king believed imprisoning his own son served the interests of the realm, then no court in the land had the authority to intervene, because he was judge, prosecutor, and supreme lawmaker. And that was not just theory. In practice, the legal system of Spain under Philip II was both tightly woven and full of loopholes. Ordinary people could be sentenced simply for owning banned books. A merchant could be fined for discussing theological issues too freely. A woman could be interrogated for suspicious behavior during prayer. And none of these required hard evidence, only an accusation. A large portion of judicial authority in matters of faith, morality, and thought belonged to the Inquisition. This was not a court in the modern sense. No defense lawyers, no public transparency, and the accused often did not know what they were charged with until the sentence was announced. In some cases, the accused never even saw their accuser. You only heard a voice from behind the curtain. Chilling, isn't it? The punishments were varied. Fines, property seizure, forced labor, or being burned alive at the stake. And guess what? These public punishments often took place like festivals, with crowds gathered to witness and pray. Perhaps that's why the society of the time lived in two simultaneous fears: fear of God and fear of the state. Beneath the surface of Catholic reverence lay a constant anxiety, because in a world where law was bent by the king's will, you could become a criminal, simply for thinking the wrong thought while asleep. And that is exactly why Don Carlos did not need to commit a crime to be punished. He only needed to cause instability, only needed to be mentally unwell, only needed to be a potential danger. That was enough. Later, scholars called this legal system a law to preserve order, not justice. It was built to silence, not to listen, to protect power, not to defend the right. And just like in the story of Don Carlos, the law could not protect you. When you lay on the scale between kinship and the crown, and when we look at the obscure death of Don Carlos, held in confinement, alone, with no one beside him at the end, a question echoes through the stone walls of El Escorial. Where was the faith in all of this? Because you must understand, under King Philip II, Spain was not only an empire, it was a temple, a grand machine operated through prayer, ritual, and fear of being labeled heretical. Philip II did not see himself as merely a king. He saw himself as the defender of the Catholic faith, the earthly arm of God. To him, ruling was not just governing, it was fulfilling a sacred mission, to keep the kingdom pure of heresy, blasphemy, and any threat to the church. This belief seeped into every corner of life. Religion touched every breath. From school lessons, baptisms, planting crops, marrying, naming children, everything had to conform to Catholic standards. People were taught that God was watching, and the Inquisition was his earthly instrument. And believe me, they truly believed it. The Inquisition was not just a religious tribunal, it was the beating heart of the ruling system, where faith was not seen as an inner life, but a certificate of loyalty. You did not believe correctly. You were dangerous. You believed differently. You were monitored. You believed quietly. You were suspicious. There was no freedom of religion under Philip II, no room for private belief, and no mercy for lost souls, even when that soul carried royal blood. The story of Don Carlos is the bitter proof of that. Some believed he was possessed by demons. Some priests claimed it was divine punishment for a sin buried in his bloodline. And so, instead of healing, he was isolated. Instead of receiving the anointing early, it was delayed until his final breath. No one dared to intervene, because to defy the king's order was to defy God's will. You see, when religion is used as a political tool, faith can become a weapon. The irony is, the Spanish people at that time were more devout than ever. Churches were always full. Statues of saints always adorned with flowers. Every event from harvest to childbirths was dedicated to God. But underneath, it was not entirely belief. It was fear framed in ritual. And if you're wondering, what about the church? Did the priests not speak up? The answer is, most remained silent or complicit. Because the church then was not only a place of worship, it was part of the government. Cardinals and bishops were often political advisors. Priests preached the gospel while recording rumors from parishioners to pass to the courts. Faith was no longer light. It was a system of spiritual control. That is why the death of Don Carlos was not honored in any church. No grand funeral, no special mass, no public memorial, not a single bishop wrote an elegy for him. Because to admit that a Catholic prince died in isolation, in madness, without forgiveness, would have cracked the entire faith structure the court had so carefully built. Modern theologians look back on this era and call it the age of controlled faith, a time when prayer came with punishment, when silence was deemed righteous, and when death in solitude could be seen as necessary to preserve the sanctity of the throne. That is not to say all was darkness. There were priests who truly grieved for Carlos. Some anonymous notes describe him clutching a crucifix, whispering prayers in delirium, perhaps to his mother, perhaps to God. No one knows for sure. And if anything saved Don Carlos at the end, it was not the court, nor the law, but a private faith no one could take away. It was a faint light, but still a light, in an empire where all belief was managed. Perhaps the final light in Carlos's life was the only thing his father could not control. And to fully understand the historical landscape around the shadowy death of Don Carlos, You cannot look only inside Spain. You must also look outward, to a Europe boiling in religious conflict, overlapping alliances, and wars that never seemed to end. Spain under Philip II was not just a kingdom. It was a European superpower, an empire stretching from the Americas, across the Mediterranean seas, all the way to distant Asia, with the Philippines named after Philip himself. But behind that powerful facade was a network of international relations, both complex and deeply strained. Relations with France. Blood-stained rivalry. Let us begin with the nearest neighbor, France. Before becoming the wife of King Philip II, Elizabeth de Valois had originally been betrothed to Don Carlos himself. Yes, you heard that correctly. The beautiful queen was almost both Carlos's fiancée and stepmother. At the same time, the plan to marry Elizabeth to Carlos was part of the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrousis in 1559, ending a long war between France and Spain. But at the last moment, Philip, then a widower, changed his mind. He married the young bride himself, regardless of her prior match to his son. This move disrupted not only the royal household, but also the diplomatic relationship between France and Spain. Outwardly reconciled, inwardly steeped in suspicion. The French court did not fully trust Philip, and Spain always viewed France as a land prone to Protestant unrest. Whenever France had a civil conflict, Spain invoked the protection of Catholicism to send in troops. And after the death of Don Carlos, some factions in the French court even suspected that Philip had deliberately eliminated his son to neutralize the potential Carlos-Elizabeth alliance. Back then, diplomacy was not just letters and protocol. It was a grand chessboard where the loser could vanish, just like the Spanish prince. Relations with England, from admiration to antagonism. And then England, where Philip had once aspired to become the consort king to Queen Mary I, and later, the husband of Elizabeth I after Mary's death. Yes, Philip II tried to court both Tudor sisters, but Elizabeth, sharp and instinctively wary, rejected him outright. From that moment, Spanish-English relations shifted from negotiation to confrontation. Elizabeth I became the emblem of independent Anglicanism, Philip the staunch defender of Catholicism. This ideological clash turned into a series of economic, religious, and military tensions. From England's support of Dutch rebels to piracy against Spanish gold fleets in the Atlantic, each minor incident poured fuel onto the fire. The climax came in 1588, when Philip II launched the mighty Armada to invade England. But the winds turned. A massive storm shattered the fleet. The English celebrated. Philip returned defeated, convinced that God did not will it. From then on, England and Spain stood in bitter opposition. And somewhere, between those cold diplomatic exchanges, Don Carlos was never mentioned again. His death became merely an internal family matter, but it contributed to the collapse of any dreams of a lasting royal alliance among Spain, England, and France. Relations with the Netherlands, colony, or powder keg. Nowhere trembled more after the death of Don Carlos than the Netherlands. At that time, it was a territory under the Spanish Empire, but the people there were Protestant and deeply resentful of Philip II's religious oppression. They saw Don Carlos, though he had never set foot there, as a beacon of hope for a more tolerant, less rigidly Catholic governance. When Carlos was imprisoned, and later died under mysterious circumstances, Dutch leaders took it as proof of the regime's cruelty. They printed propaganda portraying Carlos as a martyred saint, a soul sacrifice to preserve his father's throne. And just a few years later, the Netherlands erupted in revolt, launching the 80 Years' War for independence from Spain. It could be said, the death of Carlos was one of the sparks. With the Roman Church, a tense alliance, Philip II always saw himself as the sword of the Vatican. But even with the Pope, relations were not smooth. While the papacy desired a unified Europe, Philip repeatedly used Catholicism as a pretext for military intervention and personal expansion. Some popes even quietly criticized Philip for being dangerously inflexible. especially after he allowed the Inquisition to arrest even clergy who defied royal policies. And though both sides maintained a facade of unity, everyone knew faith was one thing, politics was another. In summary, Spain under Philip II was not isolated. It was an empire at the center of every alliance and conflict in Europe, and because of that, even private matters within the royal family, like the death of Don Carlos, could be turned into political cards by foreign powers. And when a child was imprisoned to death inside a palace, the outside world did not merely watch. They remembered, they interpreted, and they acted. We have now walked together through the layers of dust time laid over the fate of Don Carlos, the prince without a crown, the heir never recognized, the lost soul in a brilliant but cold empire. As the story closes, you might ask, was all of this truly necessary? Was one life, one son, one troubled mind, worth being buried so deeply just to preserve the polished surface of an empire? Don Carlos was not a hero, nor a perfect victim. He was defiant, unstable, at times violent, at times delirious. But he was also the product of a system where blood ties came after the crown, where love was smothered by ritual, where life was governed by distorted law and faith. In the end, his death was not solitary, because in that same court, countless souls were dying in silence. Wives married off for political gain. Ministers forced to bow before absurdity. Commoners burned alive for praying differently. There is a gentle irony in how Carlos was remembered after death, erased from official history. He became the main character in countless legends, novels, plays, and poems. He was written as the Mad Prince of Love, a symbol of youth, crushed by the gears of power. In one opera, he cries out, "I only want to live as a man." That line, though fictional, says everything. It took nearly 400 years before historians dared look at Carlos more fairly. Scholars still debate, was he truly insane, or just a victim of isolation, unbearable expectations, and love denied? No one knows for sure, but the more they study, the more they find that Carlos was not mad. He simply did not belong in a world where gentleness was seen as weakness and emotion was viewed as a threat to national security. Strange, isn't it, that someone imprisoned in darkness during his final years could become a light helping future generations understand the nature of absolute power in death? Carlos teaches us this. Glory is not enough to save a soul. A kingdom may be vast, wealthy, and pious, but if there is no room for compassion and listening, it too is just a prison made of gold. If you're still listening now, perhaps you felt a slight ache in your chest. Perhaps you've once felt like Carlos, misunderstood, locked in a role that was never yours. Perhaps you've been judged for your feelings, or silenced in a crowded room. And if so, tonight's story is not just about a Spanish prince. It's about you. About me. About anyone who has ever wanted to be understood without needing to justify themselves. So, if you ask, what did Don Carlos die of? I won't say conspiracy or politics or madness. I will say Carlos died because he lived in a world that did not allow anyone to be wrong, to be weak, to be sad. And that is the saddest, but most honest lesson history can offer us. I don't expect you to remember every detail of tonight's story, but if one thing remains, let it be this. Kindness can be silenced, but it cannot be killed. Silence can last, but someone will always listen. And a soul, no matter how long imprisoned, can still fly free through whispered stories at midnight, like tonight. Thank you for staying until the end. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, The age of Carlos has ended. But you are still here, still alive, still free. And that is what so many in the past once wished for. Sleep well. We'll meet again in another story.